Good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to our panel on the Biden administration's cyber agenda. From nation state hackers to the spread of disinformation, the Biden administration will have to hit the ground running, and our panelists are here today to share their thoughts on the people and policies to watch out for. My name is Mike McNerney, and I'm the co-founder and chair of the Institute for Security and Technology. For those of you who don't know, IST is a startup think tank that designs solutions to the world's toughest technology security problems. Our work includes areas like machine intelligence, nuclear command and control, and cybersecurity, including an upcoming task force on ransomware that we'll be announcing shortly. I'd welcome you all to explore our website and learn more. We have a great panel for you here today. Our discussion will open with a series of directed questions from our moderator, followed by audience Q&A. Please feel free to submit any questions via the social media information you can find on this page. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and my very good friend, Eli Sugarman. Eli is the director of the Cyber Initiative at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, where he leads a 10-year, $130 million grant-making effort that aims to improve cyber policymaking. He also serves on the executive board of the Cyber Peace Institute and the Independent Advisory Committee of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. I'd like to welcome Eli, who will introduce our panelists and take it from here. Eli?
Great. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the whole team at IST for having me and for pulling together this great event. I'm really excited that we have such a great set of panelists. They don't really need any introduction, but I'll give them a quick one anyway. We have Mika Eo Yang, who's Senior Vice President at Third Way's National Security Program. She's really focused on bridging the gap between Democrats and Republicans on security issues, had a long career on the Hill, serving as Chief of Staff to Anna Eshoo, who has been my Congresswoman in the Bay Area. And prior to that was a defense policy advisor to Senator Kennedy, and has also served as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee. We also have joining us Kemba Walden, who's an attorney in the Digital Security Unit at Microsoft and operates at the intersection of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection, with a newfound focus on ransomware, particularly, that we may hear about in a little bit. Kemba supports Microsoft's digital diplomacy team and their Defending Democracy program. Before Microsoft, she spent over a decade in US government service at the Department of Homeland Security. Last but not least is Chris Painter, who is the president of the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise Foundation, GFCE, which is the globally recognized leader on building cyber policy capacity, cyber diplomacy, cybersecurity, combating cybercrime. Chris held a range of senior government positions in the US, the Department of Justice, the FBI, the White House, National Security Council, and was the State Department's first cyber diplomat and cyber ambassador at the Department of State. So very excited to have all of you joining. So I wanted to start with a few bold predictions, and this comes from my fantasy football obsession that has been one of my escapes or distractions from the pandemic. And one of the things I like each year is when experts sort of predict something bold, that is something that may confound or seem counterintuitive, maybe even a slightly zany, but oftentimes appears prescient in retrospect. And I find that type of thinking helps us avoid groupthink, do something interesting. So my question to the panelists is, could you make one bold prediction about the Biden-Harris administration's cyber agenda? You know, say something provocative that folks may not have already read in the press or thought about, but it shouldn't be something as crazy as something, I don't know, Sebastian Gorka might tweet out. So with that lead up, who would like to kick us off? Any takers?
I mean, I'm happy to go first.
Thanks, Kemba.
So I'll first explain. My hope is that nothing zany happens. I don't know if this is a bold prediction, but you'll see, I think, a national security strategy, a national security plan around securing our democratic institutions that goes beyond just our elections and infrastructure. I think it'll be a multi-level, multilateral, all hands on deck kind of plan that we hadn't seen before.
Great.
All right, I'm happy to go next. I'd say I think you'll finally see cyber and cybersecurity become a true national security, economic security, and diplomatic priority. We've been moving toward that. I think you'll finally get there. And it won't take a cyber 9/11, cyber Pearl Harbor, whatever you want to call it, that people have been predicting for years. I think we're finally at that level of maturity. And I think the other thing, if I may too, is that we may see a return to cyber being treated as a real bipartisan issue. That would be a great change.
That would be a bit bold. How about you, Mika? What would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've had so much boldness over the last 4 years, from threats to 230 to like breaking of encryption and all kinds of other things, that like, I agree with Chris and Kemba, like a respite from bold moves and like banning of TikTok or whatever would be very welcome. And I do think that the Biden administration will have a very thoughtful, grounded in the rule of law approach to cyber, which I think is really important. But I do think one of the bold changes that we may see over the course of the administration is an increasing focus on cybercrime. As Kemba has talked about with ransomware, you see a real shift in the conversation because of the scourge of ransomware happening across the country. And I think that that will focus people's attention on dealing with that and trying to get to perpetrators in a very different way than what we've seen in the past.
Okay, I like it. So sort of what we're hearing is that maybe predictable or even bland is the new bold, which could be, I don't know, a hashtag for the cyber agenda that's coming down the road. So let's sort of jump to the next question, which I think sort of acknowledges that a lot of what we've been talking about is who are the people being appointed to the big roles in the administration. That's one of the early indicators of what direction President-elect and Vice President-elect are moving in. And so the old adage is that people are policy. So let's drill into that a little bit. And Chris, I want to start with you. You've served with several of the cabinet level individuals who've already been named and had a great Twitter thread, I thought, breaking down your assessment of the level of their cyber knowledge, their views on all things cyber. And so I'm wondering if you could give us a quick sort of tour de force about the National Security Cabinet, where they come down on cyber, and what you expect from each of the individuals, that have been named so far, whether it's Avril Haines or Tony Blinken or otherwise.
So I see this as a real sea change. I mean, my experience in government for over 25 years, 28 years, is that normally when people come in at that very high level, they have very little idea of what cyber is. Now, there are some exceptions. Janet Reno, for instance, was a big advocate of cybercrime before anyone else cared about it. So there have been exceptions. But usually people at that level, that's not in their background or mandate. The difference with this group, and the reason I think this is a sea change, is almost every one of these people does have experience dealing with these issues. Right at the top, President Biden dealt with the China intellectual property issue during the Obama White House and dealt with other issues as well. Kamala Harris obviously has a lot of experience from California. But then you get down to the recent appointments. Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor, he dealt with these issues both at the State Department and at the White House. So he knows them deeply and knows how to deal with China and other issues on that. So that's, I think, important. Tony Blinken, there's probably no one at the State Department I worked closer with in the last couple of years I was there than Tony. And he really does understand these issues. This is not their first love for any of them or their first priority, but it's something that they have real experience in dealing with. So it's important because he has that foreign policy perspective and national security perspective. Ali Mayorkas and I were prosecutors together back in Los Angeles many, many years ago. And he, as the head of Homeland Security, really cares about this. Avril Haines, as you mentioned, she was both at the White House and at the CIA, deeply involved in these issues. And even our UN ambassador, Linda, we worked with her on an Africa cyber strategy. So she has some background. So this is really different, having a crew come in who understands these issues at some level. Now, look, they have lots to do. There are lots of other priorities. I get that. But this is really going to be different, I think. And we'll see what happens with justice and some of the other agencies. But I think it's really important.
That's great. So building off that, I'm curious sort of what you all think and what you're hearing about some of the other key cyber officials that we're expecting or you think are going to be announced in the coming weeks. Which roles do you think are most important and who will fill them? I'm sure there's some gossip percolating in DC, out here in Silicon Valley or otherwise. And so to build off sort of that opening of the cabinet level, let's sort of go down a level or two. Anybody want to chime in about some of the roles you're expecting to see filled? What roles are most important? Who may fill them? Any interesting gossip there? That you're hearing remotely over Zoom or otherwise?
I won't comment on any gossip, but I'll say that to me the most important roles. I mean, there's existing roles that need to be filled at Defense and at Homeland Security. Chris Krebs's old role in particular, but the reinstatement or elevation or restructuring of my old office at the State Department, I think, is critically important. That person's going to be important for foreign policy. Recreating a White House cyber coordinator, much has been recommended by the Solarium Commission and the Third Way Report and others, also key. And the Third Way Report also recommended my old office at the State Department as well. that's key, because you need that conductor, that orchestration of policy, and that's what we really lacked over the last 4 years. Is we had lots of agencies doing a lot of things, but no one really bringing it together and prioritizing it. And that's important for both our friends and our adversaries to understand it's a priority. So those to me are probably two of the key positions.
How about you, Mika? Looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think, without getting too much into specifics, I think that, right, there's some factors that are going into who might wind up in some of those positions. One is that the president-elect has made some commitments to diversity and gender parity, and has talked very much about how important it is to have government that represents America. That's hard in the cyber arena. There are people like Camille Stewart out there who have a reputation and are, also fulfill those diversity commitments that the president-elect has made. I think that there's also a sense that we're seeing from the transition team, landing teams, and some of the others, a tendency to have people who've been in those jobs and done it before. So people that may be familiar faces who may move up again, people like Rob Silvers and others. And then I think that you'll see that the Biden administration will be interested in bringing in people who have experience in industry. So you could see people like Alex Stamos or others, right, coming into government and being brought in for their expertise in both industry and wrestling with some of the difficult problems that government has. So I think that you could see sort of a range of things, but I think those three factors may drive a lot of the picks that they're looking at now in this space.
Wonderful. No, I think that's really interesting, and it will be fun to see what rumor mill proves accurate, and who are some of those dark horse candidates who we don't expect, but who are gonna land the cushy roles. So, Kemba, I want to sort of bring you into the conversation and sort of acknowledge that you have a unique role at Microsoft, and obviously building off a decade of public service. And sort of, to Mika's last point about bringing in people from the private sector, sort of broadening that out, sort of how do you expect and want the incoming administration to engage with the private sector to address cybersecurity priorities? What are some of the biggest changes you expect to see? And we've already mentioned sometimes, how this administration has targeted individual companies. Presumably there will be shifts to abandon that and other ways of engaging the private sector. So would love sort of your take on sort of those suite of questions.
Sure. So with my private sector hat on, it's hard to leave the government. I left the government only 2 years ago, but with my private sector hat on, the thing that I've noticed that's the most challenging being in the private sector is that there's not a single belly button in the government to touch, to go to. And I think the Cybersecurity Commission's recommendation to have that White House level coordination will be key. So I'm hoping to see the Biden administration execute on that, sort of bringing a Michael Daniels type of person back, or even having it as a full-fledged office as recommended. Either way, I think that's key. And the reason I think that's key is because if you want to touch the government, and it goes beyond network defense, if you want to touch law enforcement or the intelligence community in some way, you just want to do it one time, and you want to make sure that when you do it, it's communicated across the interagency, across the government in a productive way. So that's with my private sector hat on. Now, as a person that straddles both occasionally, I'm hoping that the Biden administration doubles down on information sharing, right? I think Richard Clark and Bob Konecki in their book last year said that information sharing was the best bad idea that we have in cyber policy. I really do hope that the Biden administration double downs on it in spite of that, because I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to drive up the cost of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, is if there is a true, robust, constant partnership between the private sector and the government. So those are just my thoughts. Just one last thought. Just one more prediction. I also think, and maybe we'll get to this later on in the program, that DHS is going to become even more of a central agency in this space than they have been in the past. I think Chris Krebs did a great job bringing CISA to the forefront. I think we're going to see that even happen more.
Wonderful.
And maybe one other point for me too, the White House coordinator job, whoever that is. I mean, I do think it has to bridge the national security and economic parts of the job. That was our recommendation in 2009, was to create a position that would bring both the National Security and National Economic Council together, so at least have a foot in those areas. But also it has to have, as part of its job, some overview in terms of some of our military cyber operations too. I think some of the proposals have excluded that. I think that's a mistake. I think you have to look at this holistically.
Okay. Yeah, no, it gets very complicated bureaucratically when you think about how you fit it together and what authorities are vested where. I definitely want to probe on that a bit more. But for now, Mika, I want to come back to you and sort of drill down on the law enforcement and cybercrime issues here, which are ones that you all have experience with and are clearly of interest to all of you. Just want to ask you to riff off, expand anything about how you think the administration specifically will staff up those key roles at the FBI, at Secret Service, elsewhere, DHS, on the law enforcement side, and also drawing on then some of the policies that you expect to see. I know Third Way obviously wrote a very thoughtful, comprehensive report that several have alluded to, and you've got a lot of good ideas in there. Just want to tease that out and sort of let you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the law enforcement piece of it also flows from what Chris and Kemba were talking about in terms of like a need for coordination. Because one of the things that we're seeing when we talk about the cyber incidents is that we need to think about what are all the different ways that government can respond. And traditionally, we've been very heavy on the military response, and you even see that with what Cyber Command was trying to do with TrickBot. But we need to make sure that law enforcement is part of that conversation, right? What if we were indicting or arresting or jailing the people behind TrickBot, not just trying to take down their infrastructure? And I think it's really important that law enforcement is part of that conversation. Do we arrest? Do we disrupt at the human level? Do we do something else? If we don't have all those options, we can't address that. And it also is important to have law enforcement at the table when we're talking with the private sector about how to respond. You see the lack of coordination in the Trump administration, for example, on the OFAC guidance that was issued recently, suggesting that victims of ransomware might be guilty of sanctions violations if they paid, which led to a lot of anxiety and confusion as we're facing this giant ransomware scourge across the country. So I think we need the Biden administration will need to step back, get its house in order, coordinate some of those things. But I'm really encouraged by the kinds of people that they're putting on the landing teams. As Chris said, that the cabinet level appointments have experience on this, but the people who are engaging on the landing teams, especially on the DOJ side, we see deep experience with both the national security, cyber, and then private sector experience. People like Matt Olson, who was the former head of NCTC and general counsel of the NSA, Raj Day, who's in private practice, had also served at the NSA, and who are career prosecutors. So you see this sort of level of knowledge about all the different tools here that I think will be really positive. I think it's important that the Biden administration includes law enforcement as part of that conversation. And I think it's really important for people to note that the vice president has a long career of dealing with cybercrime and was on the forefront of dealing with it as the Attorney General of California, and stood up a number of policies that were instrumental in trying to help California deal with cybercrime when it is the center of technology in the United States.
Right. No, I think that's great. And I think, one of the names that's been floated for Attorney General is Lisa Monaco, who of course would bring a wealth of prosecutorial, law enforcement, cyber experience as well, given the influential role she held at the end of the Obama administration. And I guess sort of I'm wondering if you think any of the Attorney General candidates, whether Sally Yates or others who are being mentioned, are you handicapping that race and how that may influence the policies? Or you think regardless of who is chosen as AG, this will clearly, remain sort of the approach you've articulated, because obviously Vice President-elect, Harris has quite a bit of experience regardless of who's chosen as AG?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, the AG is going to have a lot of challenges to deal with to rebuild the morale of the department. Obviously, it's first and foremost, and sort of restore some of the concerns that people have had about democracy. But I think, like it or not, whoever the AG is, because ransomware is so prevalent across the country, they are going to just have to deal with that. And they'll have to bring in people who know. If they themselves don't know, they will find themselves dealing with a lot of different victims and need to modernize the department and the way prosecutions work, as well as trying to retain qualified personnel against a very eager private sector who's always trying to hire them away.
Right. I also say we've been dealing with cybercrime longer than we've been dealing with cybersecurity, frankly. This goes back many years to even 1997. We had the G8, then the G8 deal with these issues. And Lisa, when she worked for Janet Reno as her counsel, was involved in some of these cyber issues back then, but there are a number of other candidates. Sally Yates was involved in a lot of these discussions. Jay Johnson was involved deeply in these discussions. So I don't think the bench is I think the bench is pretty deep, and I agree with what was said, that whoever takes that job, I think it's going to have to be part of their portfolio.
Great. So sort of on the topic of ransomware, obviously, Kemba, Microsoft has been one of the most active private sector leaders going after these malicious, ransomware crews. TrickBot obviously has come up. That was one where Microsoft was obviously very active. I guess, are there any lessons that you and your colleagues have learned about what works well and what doesn't, vis-a-vis sort of the private sector targeting ransomware crews, collaborating with government to do joint, interdiction enforcement efforts, information sharing? And sort of how would you expect and how do you hope the Biden-Harris administration will learn from those lessons and what works and what doesn't to take perhaps a slightly more effective approach to public-private partnerships as they pertain to targeting ransomware?
Sure, that's a really big question. So I will do my best to answer it in a nice, sweet morsel here. So Microsoft's approach has always been to do criminal referrals, partnering a lot with the FBI, and then also taking civil action, right? Suing the John Does of the world, Jane Does of the world, and taking control of that infrastructure and then bringing it down. So that's been the Microsoft approach all along. What's unique about ransomware, though, is that there is not a specific infrastructure like there are not a lot of trick bots that deliver ransomware. There are other opportunities for delivering ransomware that are not infrastructure based. And then you've got this ransomware as a service problem now. So the trick with ransomware is to focus on the payment distribution systems, the cryptocurrency economy, and figure out ways to bring it down that way. So what that does then is causes Microsoft to want to engage more with government, right? So at some level, there is an engagement with FBI, but perhaps we'll engage with the Homeland Security investigations and use of some of their jurisdictions, the U.S. Postal Service investigators, U.S. Secret Service and their financial crimes mandate remit. So we're hoping to broaden engagement in that way. I'm sure that's true for all the other private sector entities that are tackling the ransomware issues for their platforms and their customer bases. But the other thing that I sort of straddling between private and public sector hope to see, particularly with the FBI, is that there may hopefully be a shift in incentives at the FBI. There seems to be an incentive for so the number of arrests that are made, sort of metrics associated with that, right? Sometimes attribution is nearly impossible, but it's not impossible to sort of choke out the threat actor in other ways without arresting them. There are some other opportunities. It's challenging, but there are opportunities there. And if there are incentives in the US government that are not associated merely with just arrests, I think we'll see more interaction for law enforcement, opportunities for law enforcement and the private sector to work together to take these things down.
That's great. And Mika, I know your report touched upon sort of measurement of how the US government targets cyber criminal groups and actors and how it measures, and the incentives overlay that Kemba pointed out, I think is a really good point. And sort of what you measure oftentimes drives then what you do, because there are rewards or penalties associated with it. Anything that you learned through that research or that's in your report that you think helps address what Kemba just mentioned?
Yeah, so I think, well, let me take it in two parts. One, the measurement, and then two, sort of more broadly on what Kemba was saying. On the measurement piece of it, one of the things that we discovered in trying to put together a metric for how much is being done against cybercrime is that we found that the numbers are very crude. We have numbers of reports, self-reported incident data that comes into the FBI, and then we can measure number of arrests. But we don't know how many of those incidents are linked together, and we don't know how many of those arrests are linked to those incidents. And so there's a real challenge here in terms of accountability for law enforcement to be able to, for itself to be able to measure what's happening when we don't have the ability to say these 5,000 incidents are the work of this one perpetrator, right? And how do we sort of match that together? That's a data challenge that I think we're going to have to wrestle with as we go forward. But we know that the crime scales. And so we have to figure out how we can do a better job of information sharing, not just with the private sector and government, but with government to figure out what's going on here. But to Kemba's point about, the government doing more collaboratively, I think that I'm hopeful that in the Biden administration, we'll actually see a different relationship to the private sector and an interest in more collaboration. One of the challenges that we saw, for example, with TrickBot is that the lack of coordination between the government and the private sector means that we may have people acting in ways that are redundant or interfering with each other. At some point, the government needs to be more willing to engage with actors who share their goals of stopping and disrupting the crime. And the national security community in particular has always been very closed off and unwilling to share. And I know in the private sector, a lot of people feel like that's a one-way information flow, but the government has got to get better at having a two-way information flow, because the government doesn't actually own the networks. They're private sector networks. And so without that cooperation, the efforts at disruption are not going to be as effective.
That's great. And so Chris, sort of remembering back to when you were a prosecutor, prosecuting some of these crimes and offenses, just wonder what sort of that experience sort of adds to the conversation, and then want to build off that and ask about the international dimensions. But curious, sort of given how you've participated in some of the law enforcement activities and probably coordinated with private sector entities, or seen them doing things in parallel and wishing you had coordinated more.
Well, and these are, like you said, these are almost always international cases. They're seldom just domestic cases, just by the nature of the criminals, who it's much smarter to route your attacks through several different countries to try to avoid apprehension. And a lot of the work I did when I was a prosecutor, I spent really the bulk of my career at Justice, either as a prosecutor or back at the mothership at Maine Justice. Ransomware is the newest pernicious brand of this, but criminals have been very good at fine tuning, coming up with new types of attacks. Botnets were the big thing a few years ago. They still are a big thing. So we're going to see new things. Ransomware is a big thing. Now there'll be new things. And we always have to stay ahead of that. And, and the idea of public-private partnership has been around, as you know, for a long time. I brought up Janet Reno. I remember in 1998, we had an event in Silicon Valley where we talked to industry about reporting, and they were reticent to report because they were worried about how they'd be treated. Some of the same things we're still talking about. I mean, one of the things I always get a little frustrated about is we have the same conversations every year for like 20 years. So, but we are making progress. And I do agree that there are ways to get information, to use it to do feedback to victims. I think that's certainly important, and not just victims. I think there are good consortiums you can build, like the No More Ransom group that's operating, that has more of a collaborative entity. The WEF is trying to do some things around that. So I think those kind of entities are really important. And the international dimension is we really do have to work with allies, partners, not just other countries, but other stakeholders in this, and convene those types of things. And part of that, frankly, is one of the things I'm doing now, which is capacity building, working around the world, making sure that a lot of countries have the capacity to deal with this. Because again, if I'm a criminal, I'm going to route my attack through countries that don't have good laws and no good capabilities. I can escape any consequences for that. And it's harder to disrupt my activities. So if we want to disrupt, which is part of it, and also arrest, we need to have those partnerships, and we need to have that capacity building.
Great. And so one of the sort of biggest purported changes the Trump administration has again, reportedly made is to free Cyber Command and the Defense Department, and sort of allow it to lean in and defend forward and persistently engage adversaries on their networks or outside U.S. networks, or however you want to describe it, right? And so I'm curious, sort of building off that international dimension, that part of the pushback on that change was, are you taking into account all the international equities, all the diplomatic equities, all the equities of allies and their concerns about us defending forward and operating in their networks, potentially without their knowledge or without their approval? And I'm just sort of curious how you think, all of you, sort of how the Biden-Harris administration will go about striking that balance between being appropriately proactive to target these groups, but at the same time building alliances and working with others to have more effect. And part of the reason why I'm using words like purportedly and reportedly is we still don't actually know what they changed, because there hasn't actually been much transparency or a blog post or anything that was declassified, like the Obama administration did quite well about the VEP and certain information that came out there. So curious sort of how you integrate, I guess, sort of that forward projection of capability and sort of the international strategy dimensions, given that at least the perception right now is that the Trump administration is not necessarily doing it in a very holistic or comprehensive way.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that, Eli, because I do think that there's a real challenge. We've seen a rise of assertions of digital sovereignty internationally, people feeling very much like our networks are our networks and stay off them and we'll regulate them. It is not sort of the free fire zone of this internet domain, as it's sometimes described in the defense space. It's just not that. They don't own, sort of dominating the domain may cause serious diplomatic challenges for the United States. I think it's really important for the Biden administration to get in there and figure out what authorities were used, were granted to Cyber Command to understand that, and then also to understand that in the context of what authorities are appropriate. Because when you use Cyber Command, you're using Title 10 authorities, and if you're using them in a way that is causing effects, I think that there are some serious questions there about whether or not those have been authorized, because we're not talking about doing them consistent with the post 9/11 AUMF or the 2002 AUMF or anything else that would give the military the authority to operate extraterritorially. So understanding that legal guidance and what the limits, the right and left boundaries are of that is really important. But I do think that you'll see the Biden administration looking to restore rule of law and more respect for the international community than what you've seen in the unilateralism of the Trump administration.
So one of my favorite terms that my military friends always used to use is there's blue space, which is the US, there's red space, which is the adversary, and there's gray space, which I always used to call other country space. So, these kind of blurrings of how you do these things and what jurisdiction means in cyberspace. So first of all, let me just say, I think we have to have this tool in our toolkit, this arrow in our quiver, if you will. We have to have the ability to do the disruption that Cyber Command has done. I'd say there's a number of things we could do differently. One, I think we can be more transparent about it. If we're trying to deter bad actors, we should say, we're doing this. Right. You stop doing it, we'll stop doing it. We don't do that very well. It's still grounded in the very kind of classified world where we're not good at that. Now, obviously, you don't want to give away your sources and methods while you're doing these actions, but you need to do it. The bigger issue, one issue you hit on, it's not the bigger issue, is that, although these are important tools, they're not the only tool. It's not the hammer looking for the nail, right? It has to be one tool that's used in an integrated way with all our other tools, and that hasn't happened. We had agencies kind of going off on their own without that, that conductor I've talked about that would synchronize these things. And it may not be the best tool to use in a particular circumstance, or it may be better to have your ally or partner do these things for you rather than do it yourself. And in fact, if we want to build the capabilities of our allies and partners and have a more collective response to these threats, which is what the the deterrent strategy of the State Department is, then we need to work with those allies and partners and allow them to do these things. So my worry is that if we're just doing these things and we're doing them on allied territory, which is now called red space because of the if the adversary's infrastructure is there, it makes it red space. If we do that, and we end up pissing them off, that doesn't really help us down the road, either in cyberspace or more generally. So we can work together. There may be times, I have a friend in the State Department that used to say, if the flaming ball of cyber death is coming toward you, you have to act. Well, yes, but that's not often the case. You have time often to work with allies, to often deconflict with the law enforcement and intelligence community. This has to be a whole of government enterprise, and really a whole of government enterprise that leverages our other countries who are friends and partners of ours and builds on those.
Yeah. And so, Kemba, I'm curious. Oh, please, can I just ask one sort of question? Because I'm curious, sort of given Microsoft, of course, has like a global footprint and remit, and curious sort of how you engage with sort of foreign governments and partners in the context of some of these activities that you've described to sort of take down threat actors. I'm curious sort of how much that aligns with sort of the sort of inclusive approach that we want the U.S. government to follow, or how much of it is a more a U.S.-centric approach. And then obviously anything else you'd like to add. So sorry for interjecting.
So from a private sector perspective and a global company like Microsoft, we really, so Microsoft sort of is one of the primary founders of the Cyber Tech Accord and one of the principal founders of the Paris Call. So one of the approaches that I like I'd like to see in the Biden administration is encouraging international norms, cyber norms, maybe even encouraging at some point, right, some grand cyber doctrine or treaty that will govern the use of cyber measures, right, across countries, across companies. It's a multi-stakeholder approach that Microsoft would like to encourage, and that's the message that we propagate across where we work, where we exist. The other thing I'd like to say, just sort of to add an extra layer to everything that I agree with everything that Chris and Micah said, is that, you know, I don't have grave concerns about U.S. Cyber Command and their abilities. I think we need those capabilities, and like you said, it should be another quiver in our sort of with our arrows here. But we should, the Biden administration should think about this in a different way, right? We should defend first, sort of, and not use military sort of as the first line of defense, because our adversaries are not operating in the same way that we think of when we think of sort of cyber war, international rules of international war, right? And I don't mean to use war here, but when our adversaries attack, if they attack, they're not going to use obvious means, right? They'll go around, they'll go under, they'll go through to get at our critical infrastructure. And so when I said earlier, you'll see, I think, DHS play a more central role. It's because foreign adversaries are able to get into our networks in a way that don't necessarily invoke Title 10 authorities, right? So you'll have to use not just Title 10 authorities, but Title 6 authorities and other authorities to be able to defend first. So I think just it's one tool, and we should be transparent about it, but be a little bit more creative about how we respond to some of these attacks.
Great. Yeah, no, I think transparency is a very critical value and something that we're all hoping to see more, because I think one of the challenging aspects of this broader cyber debate is, as several of you pointed out, a lot of the capabilities and actors come from the IC, where there's a culture of secrecy, oftentimes for good reason, but it outlives its usefulness, especially when these become broad issues of import to society, and it's really hard to talk about them in a meaningful and substantive way if you don't actually know what's going on. And the government, I think it's fair to say, needs to do a bit better in that respect. So at this point, I'd like to shift to a couple of questions that have come in from participants, both before we kicked off and during this live stream. And so just going to throw these questions out there. They're pretty much open for anybody who would like to answer, and we can sort of see where they take us. So I want to come back to CISA, and Chris Krebs has come up a little bit, and I think we're all pretty disgusted, I would say, by the death threats and other abuse that's been directed his way for doing, I think, a quite admirable job, along with many other elected officials and volunteers throughout the country defending our elections. But CISA, obviously, to the point I think Kemba and others have made, has grown into a critical player over the last few years. Suzanne Spalding and others contributed to that a lot, Jeanette Manfra. Sort of curious about CISA and the role and information operations and disinformation, which is of course not the same as cybersecurity, but in certain instances there's overlap because of integrated campaigns that threat actors use. And so I want you to stretch a little bit and would love your take on how do you think CISA and the US government will deal with some of these information operations in the future, realizing that the elections are sort of a discrete case, public health and COVID is a discrete case, but also a really challenging one given the First Amendment, US traditions, but that some of these do have more of a cybersecurity nexus than others. And so just want to throw that out there to see what direction you think that's going in terms of US government, the role of CISA, because obviously that general threat and challenge is I think clearly not going away, and if anything is only going to get worse in the coming years. Who wants to take that really easy softball?
Well, I'll start again. Just one thing on our last topic. I agree defense is important and hardening the target is important, but there also has to be accountability for bad actors. There has to be consequences for them, not escalatory consequences, but we have to do both, right? We have to be able to both harden the targets and make sure there are consequences. It's like the old, when I was a prosecutor, you can lock your doors and windows, but if people broke in, there has to be consequences, and we need to do that here too. I think CISA has a critical role to play. I've often said that back when the Russians interfered with the election back in 2016, we weren't prepared for that. You know, the cyber community did cyber stuff, and we were worried about infrastructure attacks and theft of intellectual property. The intelligence community did their stuff. There wasn't really this blended disinformation community who both had the cyber chops, but also understood disinformation issues and how to fight them. And CISA, I think, has played and will play a big role in this, but they're not alone. I think we have to really have across the government, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, everyone. You really need a group that's focused on this issue as a hybrid issue. It's not just in one bucket or the other.
Yeah, I would agree with Chris on that. I mean, I think CISA has become the place that people go to in the government to address these issues because it has so much more credibility, and so many of the other actors have a fraught relationship with the private sector. You know, NSA, which has tremendous technical capability for a variety of reasons, is distrusted by the technology community, and I understand why. And I think that there's also a concern, especially given the FBI demands about encryption, why people are uncomfortable dealing with the FBI, which is actually a place that you would want to go to disrupt mass disinformation campaigns, because essentially what those people are doing is the equivalent of fraud, right? They're, the people behind them can be in some cases, right, trying to deprive people of various things or endanger them. But CISA has to be, as Chris says, part of the solution. And maybe the credibility that they have built up over the years and the competence that they've built up has the ability to be that central place where they can facilitate those conversations with some of those other actors. But it's important to not try and make it everything, right? This is a cross-cutting issue, and the coordination really has to come at the White House.
So I'll just contribute a bit here, because I was most recently at CISA and worked the 2016 campaign and the elections and the 2018 elections as Chris's primary lawyer on those issues. So the good news is that CISA is there, right? And that CISA has become a larger player and a trusted player in this space. But I absolutely agree with Micah and Chris that it's cybersecurity is everyone's concern. It's an all hands on deck kind of issue. It's not a single issue. That said, one of the things I think, one of the strengths for CISA and the Biden administration is going to be sort of operating at that civil society layer, right? Empowering civil society to combat disinformation. I think that's a key gap that CISA is going to fill in this information operations space, right? Along with State Department and intelligence community and the Department of Defense. But we're going to see, I hope, CISA contribute to offering a counter narrative to the dangerous narratives that are out there. I'm hoping to see that CISA contribute to a return to the use of, dare I say it, soft power and cyber diplomacy, right? Contribute to those efforts in order to combat information operations in this space. CISA has, or the Biden administration has an opportunity to sort of take a look again and institutionalize trust at the base level. Right. I mean, you're seeing right now a significant portion of the population just not trusting our institutions. So I think that CISA can be at the forefront of just creating that foundation for institutionalizing trust so that we can build opportunities for combating information operations, disinformation, whatever you want to call it, active measures.
Yeah, and I think you can link that with things like the Global Engagement Center at State, which I think needs to do a lot more than it has in the past. And I think it really needs to engage in this. You know, my biggest worry, though, is we can't keep our eye off the ball on election interference. We're past an election, but it's going to happen again, and we need to keep focused on that. But I also worry about domestic disinformation, which is much harder than foreign disinformation because of all the reasons we know. And that's going to be a real challenge for all of us.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that while CISA is doing commendable work, clearly the organizations seem to be at the forefront of how do you combat domestic disinformation are the social media platforms, right? Who are oftentimes the ones making decisions about how to label, how to decide what is misinformation or disinformation, and that's the public-private distinction and sharing of responsibilities, yet complicated roles with the First Amendment. I take the point that the domestic origin disinformation is a really thorny one, and understandably, U.S. government actors get very queasy about dealing with it, given to the extent the U.S. government cares about our laws and norms, which it generally does, you don't want to transgress the First Amendment. But sort of let me pick up one of everybody's maybe favorite or perhaps not so favorite cyber debates that I think Mika mentioned, which was the encryption debate. And this is a question that came in from the audience: is, does anybody want to predict what we expect vis-a-vis encryption policy in 2021? Do we expect any changes in policy from DOJ, FBI, movement on the Hill? Not to say a bold prediction, but is this something that you're following that you think is going to move, or have we sort of reached another sort of equilibrium stasis point in the conversation?
So it's my hope that this debate about exceptional access to encryption goes away for a while, because it seems to me that there are senior players close to the Biden team who are not particularly interested in doing that, especially when, as people like Matt Olson wrote, he's now on the landing team, he wrote in his Don't Panic report, there are other things that law enforcement could be doing to resolve its concerns. So I think that idea is in the bloodstream, that we need to start addressing some of these other things. And I think what's clear is that we need to have a healthier conversation between the government and the private sector about how to deal with bad actors, that it should not be adversarial between the government and the private sector across the table, but they should be on the same side of the table dealing with malicious actors who are trying to scam people out of their retirement accounts, ransom their data, steal their intellectual property, or disrupt their choice in elections. There are many people who should be the bad guy, and we should not be thinking about, right, the people who are operating networks or the people who are trying to arrest bad guys as the bad guy, right? There are some real bad actors out there, and we should be able to identify what the common interests are.
Yeah, I'd say it continues to be an intractable problem, because we've been talking about this also a long time. I'm a veteran of the crypto wars back in the 80s, so that when we were talking about banning the export of encryption, which never made any sense. And even when we had the legislation post 9/11, the Patriot Act legislation, encryption was too controversial to put into that. So this is not something I think you're going to see legislation on. We had a very nuanced multi-agency effort in the Obama administration that involved both the economic players and the civil rights player, or the civil society sort of players in government, the folks that dealt with those issues, and the security players. And we talked about a lot of different options, but none of them are easy. And it is true. I do think there are other ways to get this data. I think, as we said back then, the best way is to actually deal with these companies and work with them and see what the trade space is. The problem is when you have things that are designed to completely not allow any ability for law enforcement to look at them, and you have major events happen. And I hate policy that's driven by major, events. Let's go back to the 9/11, Pearl Harbor issue, and I hope that doesn't happen. So I don't think I think we're going to step back a little bit and look at this more realistically and see what can be done. But I just don't really see a clear answer going forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's where I come down too. And I mean, one of the nice things is I think you are seeing some more balanced, very thoughtful, more granular analysis and thinking from civil society, whether it's the Carnegie Endowment's encryption working group, which interestingly had some very senior level former Obama officials participate, because I think they felt that process you described, Chris, never solved the problem, so to speak, just given how intractable it is, and of the various issues they could have chosen to focus on post administration, that was one that I think they wanted to continue to focus on, and so it'll be interesting to see. But I think yeah, I don't see this being sort of agenda item 1 through 5, given all of the other things that the incoming administration is going to be dealing with on the cyber front or otherwise. Sort of a question that just came in that's pretty interesting, coming to sort of the sort of how do we think about the sort of global architecture or infrastructure for protecting cyberspace? Is it the D10, the T12? Is there another construct? Do we engage predominantly with democracies to form these? Is there some other sort of framework that we should use to think about what could be that type of international coalition, if you will? And the question doesn't seem to be specific about combating cybercrime or otherwise, but I think this has come up in all of your comments, Mika vis-a-vis cybercrime, Kemba on some of the digital diplomacy, Tech Accord, Paris Call, and Chris obviously just across the board given the cyber diplomacy. So I'm curious sort of if you have, I guess sort of to put it another way, if the State Department's new Cyber Bureau is created, is successful, is influential, there is an integrated international strategy across the USG. One thing it could put for potentially is sort of a global architecture change or a coalition for protecting cyberspace from malicious actors of different kinds. Curious sort of if you have any thoughts or anything specific you'd like to see or that you think is the right direction to move in that broad space.
Yeah, so I think there's a mix here. You don't have to there's not one ring that rules them all. There doesn't need to be, I think. You can use different forums for different things. The G8 and now the G7, I think is very effective as a crucible of like-minded countries to come up with some information that you can then sell to a larger group. When we reached the deal with China on intellectual property theft, that was taken to the G20, which I think is important. You have to deal in groups like the UN where you're going to have non-like-minded countries to try to get some basic precepts like the 13 norms that were agreed to, including the norm against attacks on infrastructure, is important to have even potential adversaries agree to, because then you can hold them accountable for that. So you need those forums as well. But I do think there's space to deal with other like-minded democracies to try to set, what the rules should be, but then also to enforce them in some collective way. I think there is some space to do that. I think that makes sense. Kemba, I do think that norms are critically important in getting more understanding of them. I still don't think a treaty is ripe anytime soon. We see nation states violate existing treaties all the time. So I worry about that. And we know that some actors like China and Russia want to use those treaties to control information and not really to deal with the problems we're faced with. So I think really getting a more collective approach, reaching out to allies, doing that, actually some of the deterrence initiative was based on that the State Department has been pursuing. I think you can build on that in particular to reach around to countries. But also, going back to my first point, my prediction, you want to mainstream this issue more too. So if there is a move to call countries together who are like-minded democracies on a whole range of issues, this should be one of them. This should be one of the issues we talk to them about and have it at the higher political level.
Just to address Chris and your comment about treaties, I absolutely agree. But I think there is an appetite for some sort of framework, right? Some sort of legal, lawful framework. And there are building blocks to get there, obviously, right? So you start with norms, start with principles, but start, I feel like, is the message here, is what I feel like the Biden administration is going to do. They're going to do something to start.
Yeah, Eli, to your point about international engagement and security, I do think one of the things that we as a nation have to do better is develop a sense of what we want that international security architecture to look like. And I don't think the United States has a good sense of that. And we cannot keep saying country of origin as a proxy for whether or not technology is good or bad. Like, there has to be some standard. The US has not been particularly good about engaging in standards making bodies. And I am certainly not an expert on that, but I think that we really need to do better in that conversation. I think that it's tough to just engage with democracies, though. And one of the things that we see in the negotiations over Cloud Act and trying to deal with these MLATs is that there are very few countries that we can actually reach agreement with about how we deal with some of these malicious actors on the internet. I do think, to Chris's point, we have to start demonstrating the norms and principles in cyberspace through enforcement. And by demonstrating, we deem certain kinds of behavior unacceptable. And by bringing indictments, we can say to other countries, we think this behavior is beyond the pale in cyber. And for those that are gray space actors, really put the question to them: do you as a nation own this activity, or do you agree that this is illegal? And by starting to do that and putting the question to other countries, we can start having a conversation and identifying those countries that are interested in enforcing and those that are unwilling or unable to enforce. And I think that would be a huge step forward. But I just don't think that we are in a place right now where even if we were to be able to adopt a treaty, it would make a substantive difference in behavior, because much of the cyber malicious activity is not done by nation state actors who can just order people to stop. A lot of this is criminal activity. Like, business email compromise is not something that is coming out of the FSB.
Big distinction, though, between unwilling and unable. And I know you agree with this, Mika, that there's lots of folks that they're unable, and that's why capacity building is so important. There are some folks that are unwilling, and therefore we have to be, clear with them that this is a big deal. One of the things I think works so well in reaching an agreement with China on intellectual property theft, which had an impact for a couple of years before things with China started falling apart more generally, is that we said this was part of the overall relationship with that country. We need to be willing to say that this is such an important issue that we're going to use not just a cyber channel, but how it affects our overall relationships, and do that with other countries as well.
Yeah. And, when you asked us for bold predictions at the beginning, Eli, I should have said, I do think that the Biden administration is going to have to wrestle with the technology relationship with China, because we are left with in a very bad place after 4 years of the Trump administration. What's happening with sort of the abrupt threats against TikTok, the debate that we've had about Huawei, some of the things that we've had about CFIUS, and what Chris's efforts, with the IP agreement showed is that it is possible with sustained attention and pressure to try and get better behavior out of China. The question is, can we do it again after the chaos that has happened over the last 4 years?
Let's sort of close with that, because in just a couple of minutes, the CEO of IST, Phil Reiner, is going to join us for some closing remarks. But I think we have time to sort of talk a little bit about China, because there are, I think, many people of the view that one of the Trump administration's arguable foreign policy successes is to bring more attention to China as a strategic competitor, rival, malicious actor, however you want to describe it, across many different areas, by making that, perhaps even a bit, going overboard and making it, attacks be racist and all sorts of other things. But there seemed to be, to your point, a lack of an integrated, coherent strategy, bringing it all together. And so, but that's really challenging, right? Given the trade and economic dimensions, given, coming back to soft power and all the students, like there are multiple facets of that. And so any closing thoughts on sort of how to manage the China relationship and dimension, focusing on cyber, but obviously you all touch other areas too. I'm curious if you have any advice or ideas for what you think concretely should be done, given that over the past few years, we've seen sort of a policy all over the map.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, that's a problem. The policy has been all over the map. And, an example of that has been on 5G, for instance, where I don't have any issue with the US government raising that. We should be raising that as a core issue. The way we did it, threatening some of our allies and not sharing information with them, which shoots us in the foot more than them, is problematic. So there are ways to do this. And I do think we have to, it goes back to what I said before. Don't treat cyber as this little boutique issue. Put it in the larger relationship of how we're dealing with China. It took years to raise the theft of intellectual property with China, because I think a lot of decision makers at a high level were like, well, the economic and other issues with China are too big. This is just a side issue. It's not. It was, when it was deemed as core to our economic future, it became an issue. So let's think about these issues in the context of an overall China relationship. Let's, have dialogue when appropriate with them, but not just for the sake of having dialogue, but for actually achieving some concrete results. And it's going to be hard. I think that's definitely going to be hard, but we need to do that.
Okay. Kemba or Mika, any final thoughts on China?
Oh, go ahead, Kemba. What were you about to say?
So all I was going to say was that this is one of those issues. You're right. The Trump administration did create some chaos, but the fact that China is a country to contend with is not new, right? That was true in the Obama administration and prior. So this is not new. I think we're going to have to find a way to deal with supply chain issues all up, not just targeting China. We're going to have to deal with certain other cyber issues all up, not just targeting China. And I think that there are going to be creative opportunities to do that. I just don't know what the answer is. But it's not a new concern.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this problem, Eli, because I think it has so many implications, right? We have the number 1 and number 2 economies on the planet. We share custody of the global economy, right? We cannot just walk away from each other and divide the world into a Chinese sphere and a Western sphere. That's just not acceptable. So we have to figure out how to work with the Chinese. For a long time, we thought that trading with China would make them more open and transparent and more like the US. And while they've adopted a lot of the market capitalism pieces of it, they haven't really come around on a lot of the values fronts. And I think we need to do a better job of articulating what it is that we want to see out of them. And I think the number 1 issue about that is a lot of more transparency. because and a lot more sort of assurance about security and things like that. We need to really think about those issues because right now I think there's a sense of on both sides, we don't fully understand each other.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Mika. Thank you, Kemba. Thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed the panel. I thought it was great, and want to hand it over to Phil, the CEO of IST, our host, to sort of wrap things up.
Hey, everybody, and thank you, Eli. I think first and foremost, I definitely want to say thank you to Eli and to the panelists. I know you all have tremendous demands on your time. You've probably maybe even got kids banging on your doors right now, kind of like I do. So really can't thank you guys enough for taking the time. I think what has come through to me in this discussion is just how many issues there are on this cyber agenda for an incoming administration at this point. The need to actually prioritize it, get the bureaucracy right, get the manning right, but then actually get some stuff done with international partners and do something about all these various threats. I want to say thank you to everybody that dialed in. Clearly, there's a level of interest in this that will continue. Stay in touch with us at IST. We're going to continue to work on some of these issues, whether it be ransomware, network security, infrastructure, all of the rest of it. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And again, thank you to our panelists and to Eli for moderating this.